Hello and welcome to It's Personal Stories. My name is Lan Elliott on behalf of It's Personal Stories. And today I'm really happy to have my friend Dave McCaslin on with us. And Dave is partner with CapStar Advisors and has had a tremendous career. If you're not familiar with Dave's career, I hope you will go on our website to check out all the wonderful he's done over the course of his career. Welcome, Dave.
Well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. So always happy to help.
Thank you. Dave, I know you've had just an incredible career and just admired the things that you've accomplished over the years. Could you share some of the pivotal turning points in your career and if there were any factor or factors that contributed to your success?
Sure. I think in thinking about it, there's probably one thing that actually before my career started. I played baseball as a kid, and my father did not play a lot of baseball, but he coached me. And I didn't realize it till later, but he would always set out every other player on the team, and then I played a different position every year because he put me at the position that was the weakest position. So I think in retrospect, it really taught me to value teamwork, to be fluid in what I did. I learned a lot of different things and to kind of how to build teams. And then I think from a corporate standpoint, I had a pretty traditional start, hotel degree, got into ops. I was with Weston and then went to a smaller company, Lincoln. And I had a chance at in my late 20s, to either go with PKF and become a consultant like a lot of my friends did, or to go with another large company in Trust House Forte. And that might even lead to international, or I had a chance to help start a company. And so I figured that I was young, I was married, but I didn't have any children yet. And that if I was going to do it, this was the time to do it. And so that has led me to being sort of a serial entrepreneur. And that is probably the single pivotal career moment that I really had.
That's so interesting, this spark to be an entrepreneur. Do you think that came naturally? You always had it, or do you think that first experience led you to be more comfortable with more entrepreneurial pursuits afterwards?
I was probably raised fairly traditionally, but I was always had a lot of curiosity. And so I wanted to do things, I wanted to learn and to explore. And I found that most of the other things sort of put you into a little bit of a box. And so I think I always had a little bit of a spark to try it. But I don't know that it was necessarily inbred or I was destined to do it. I think the circumstances just led me to it. And then once I did it, I just loved the kind of continual innovation of it.
Yeah. And you had mentioned curiosity, which is a trait that a lot of leaders have mentioned on our podcast. And what I find interesting is that the skills that take you to about halfway through your career serve you really well. And then usually you come to a point where you realize, oh, there are some other things that I need to learn how to do that I didn't need up until now. But now I need to focus on and develop those new skills. Did that happen with you? Was there something you discovered that, okay, now in my new role or in this next chapter, I really need to focus on a new skill?
I think the biggest change, we were always sort of dealing with teams when you're in a hotel type of situation. But for the most part, early in your career, you're in positions where what you do in that job determines what happens. And you can generally, through force of will or force of personality, dictate what happens within a smaller zone. And then I think when you get to a larger platform, you realize that you can't really do everything. And you have to figure out how to kind of pull back and let other people do things and still make sure they're on the same pathway that you want, and provide them with feedback. But you just get to that point where you can't do it all yourself. And I think that's probably the biggest struggle for most people. It was a bigger struggle for me at a point because you're used to what you do that made you successful. And then you have to sort of pull back from that. And then once I became comfortable with it, it was actually fine, and I could get a lot more done. So it was actually a great learning experience, but it was a learning experience.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point, which is what makes you successful through sheer force of will or hard work or whatever gets you to a certain point. But like you said, you can't scale, you can't then move on to bigger roles unless you learn how to work through other people and help other people be successful, and learning to delegate, right? And letting go. And for those of us who are control freaks, letting go tends to be quite difficult. But
It's
I think
scary. It's actually very scary.
it's scary, right? But I think learning and growing in a way as a leader where you can then impart to your team how to do things and ensure that they're stepping up their game and they're growing, all of that can also be super fulfilling.
No, I think it is, and it allows you to expand what you're doing and to continue to learn, because otherwise you continue to do the same things you've always done. And so when you do find that you can let go, allows you to expose yourself and continue to learn. So I like that personally, and I think it's what's best for corporate organizations.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think eventually people want to learn new things, and you're right, you have to let go of other things in order to learn the new things that you need to do. I wanted to talk a little bit about taking risks because you talked about the entrepreneurial piece of it, about being at a crossroads and choosing that entrepreneurial road. How do you approach taking risk? How do you prepare yourself mentally to do something like that? Is it something that comes naturally to you, or do you have a method? What's your trick for approaching risk?
I think risk is called risk because it's scary and the outcome is unknown, right? And so I think that I don't know that it comes naturally to people. I think it's a little bit learned of what you do and what you want to take. And so I think that from my standpoint, I always try to look much further down the road in terms of was what I was doing, if it was a risk, I didn't always analyze it just in terms of the risk of what was in front of me. I'd look at, does it help me get somewhere down the road, and could I do things that would help sort of minimize that risk? And so, one of the ones I've talked to some other people that thought I was probably a little bit crazy to do it, but when I was with a company called Northwood, we started from scratch. We had not, we did the first hotel. It was me. That was the only corporate employee. It was a smaller project, but I hired the right GM. And I knew I could work with that person. By the second person, I had somebody in accounting, and so we did our second hotel. And our third hotel was the New York Palace, which was doing $190 million a year, and we had 2 corporate employees. And normally, you would have said this was impossible, but I figured out what I needed, and I went and talked to people that I trusted, and I got together a team of 3 people that I knew, and I got them to agree that if we got this deal, that we would go forward, and kind of laid out what the path looked like. And so 5 weeks before closing, we went hard. They all gave their notice. 2 to 3 weeks before we took over, they walked in the door, but they were all seasoned people, and they had their specializations. And I knew kind of what I had already analyzed the hotel, where the opportunities were and what not to really play with. So that was a large risk, but I think you mitigate your risk when you plan and when you sort of understand what could make things go wrong, and you take steps to correct those.
Yeah. I do like the idea of putting a box around the risk that you're taking and saying, okay, what can I do to mitigate different risks? How do I bring the risk profile down a little bit? And I love the idea also of bringing in trusted people from your network. And I do want to get to that in a second. But I love that theme as well of mitigating risk by bringing in people that you trust and using your relationships to help you get through that. Well, anyone who takes a lot of risks, and you've had to take a lot of risks to be as successful as you are, sometimes things don't turn out the way you hope. And I think for a lot of us, it's a situation where you learn more when things don't go right than you do when everything goes perfectly according to plan. And I'm wondering if you've had a setback that was a great learning opportunity for you.
Oh, I've had more than one setback, but I think nobody sets out to fail at anything that they do. But I do agree it's a truism that you learn more from what you don't do well than what you do well. And you can take those learning experiences and kind of grow with them. But it's painful at the time. And so I've always sort of looked at it honestly. If I hired somebody, I would ask the question, if they didn't really have failures, I tended not to hire them because I didn't want somebody who had been that conservative. And if they had a failure, how would they actually handle it? I wanted somebody that knew kind of what they were doing. So I was probably famous when I was CEO of Ameristar. I had a large picture in my office of 8 hotels, and they were the 8 hotels that I had dealt with that I felt like I had failed at, and that they all had something wrong with them, and that I either hadn't seen or that we couldn't overcome, like a market or a physical product or a location. And I had it in my office as a reminder of what those things were, so that when I looked at anything new, it would tell me, like, how do I make sure that I learned from those things and didn't repeat that? And, I think that's probably it on the hotel side. On the corporate side, there was one startup that I did that we ended up being financially successful. And that company still exists and they're doing fine. But I came into it as a startup with a certain set of cultural values. They had a different set of cultural values, the people that I was partnering with. And, it was professional, but in the end run, it just didn't really work. And I think that the lesson that I really learned from that is that you really are investing with people as opposed to more so your capital and what those people do and kind of how you feel comfortable with them. You don't really even have to like them, but you have to respect them, and you have to know that when things go bad, you can trust them is probably the most important thing. And that's probably the most important lesson that I think I pulled out of anything that I've done that I would ask somebody listening to this to contemplate.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that's really interesting in terms of when you put together a company and you're partnering with people. How do you figure out who are the right people for you? I know you mentioned failure, checking if they have ever failed and how they handled it. But are you looking for certain things when you go into business with someone? Do you now have, I know you had your 8 deals that you try and not make those same mistakes again, and that's your reminder, almost your checklist. But do you have in your mind certain values or certain things you're looking for when you're going into business with people?
I think I do look at how they've handled adversity in the past and how they interact with people. And I do that because honestly, when things are going well, you can get along with anybody. Checks are coming in the door. There's not a lot of friction. There's really nothing to argue about. And it's only when COVID, economic depression, interest rates go to 12% or whatever. It's only when there's some extraordinary event and the pressure is really hitting that you can tell when somebody, how they act, how they deal with you. Do they look to put the blame somewhere, or do they kind of jump in and try to help you work with it? And so I think the biggest thing is, like, is it somebody that I can really trust when the chips are down? Because if you're, in our business and your view is 5 to 10 years out, the chances of nothing bad happening over that time frame are about nil. And so you want to know that you can get through those periods with the people that you're with. And I think the other things that I look for is, in some cases, do they have a specific talent that you can put them in that area and have them do? I tend to value fluidity. I've always been more of a growth person. So people that can handle change is probably a big deal for me. That may not be as big of a deal for other people that are perhaps a little bit more static in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. And I actually look for people that have a little bit of something to prove. Is that, whether that's in their career or in their personal goals or something like that, where I know they're going to, just when the things get tough, put out a little bit extra. And I think that's part of what drove me. And I respected that for people that I would kind of surround myself with. Those are the things that I would tend to look for. There are roles that's not necessarily the right thing for the entire world or for every organization. But for me and what we were trying to do, that was what was very, very important to me.
Yeah, those are really important traits to look for. Thank you for sharing that, and for sharing, what you've learned when things don't go the way you hope they will. And you're right. In our industry, you're always going to have downturns. It's just the nature of it. And investments, when you're doing deals and you're working on things, they are unlikely to get done in a short enough period of time where we don't run into one of these cycles. So I think approaching things in that way of, what happens in the worst case scenario and who are you with in the trenches at that moment is such a great lesson to think about. Along those lines, I wanted to talk about developing a network, because you have quite a vast network from your years in the industry. But I'm curious how you've developed your network in a way that's comfortable for you, that's authentic to you.
I think a couple things. One, it's sort of an overused phrase, but like, I like people. And so in our industry, most of the people that I run into, I like. Almost most of the rest of them, I may not like, but I'm okay with. And there's really only a handful of people that I just really distrust, which I came down to. And so if you go out with the approach that most people are basically good, if you allow them to be good, you can form bonds or friendship with people. And because I was putting myself into situations where I was in growth companies, I developed deep networks within kind of what I call the ops performance areas, because we always needed people to run hotels, whether at the corporate or at the hotel level. But you also ran into franchisors, capital partners, vendors, competitors, right? That came into play. And it is a social business. And so I think being a social business, I really could find ways to kind of relate to people. And if I could relate to them, I felt more comfortable with them over time. And in the end run, you really only judge somebody by how they did within their work. But if you felt comfortable with them, you could share things and share experiences and things of that nature. And I think the mistake people often make is even the term developing a network goes and assumes sort of a transactional, I need to find somebody who does X and their value is what they can do for me. And I think people sense that and don't like that. And so if you can help people, even when there's nothing in it for you directly, but you develop a relationship with them, it helps you. And you don't really even have to expect anything in return. Amazingly, sometimes 15 or 20 years later, something may come up and you do get help, right? And people went about it. But I would say the one thing I see of people coming up today is you don't necessarily have to do anything crazy, but they're all worried about, did I do something silly, or I want balance, or I want this, is that they view the relationships as being transactional. And I think you should really view it as a relationship. It's not as important as a family relationship. It's not as important as a extremely personal relationship, but it's a relationship. And if you stay in the industry, you're going to know these people for 30, 40 years through ups and downs in their career and their personal life and things that happen. And I think you want to do that. If you look at it as purely a transactional situation, I don't think it really goes well. But all you essentially have to do is expose yourself to a broader variety of people. So if there's a chance and there's a reception at one of the conventions, it's an hour and a half in the evening, right? Don't run back to your room and play on your phone and do whatever the other things are. Like, go to the reception, talk to people, and don't just talk to the people that you already know. Talk to other people or have them introduce you, and kind of work from that standpoint. And if you don't like somebody, you don't have to develop a relationship with them, but you do have to get out there and talk to people. And most people are pretty good. So if you just broaden your network, you'll find people that you like, and you'll be able to help each other over time. It's not really that different. You just have to spend a little bit of time and effort at it.
Yeah. I love what you said about these relationships lasting many years and decades. And I've definitely found that to be the case. And it's been wonderful, actually, to be able to follow friends through the different evolutions of their careers over the years. And, maybe there'll be a time where you can work together. Maybe there's a time where you can help one another. But I do love the idea of making it more about the relationship and not being transactional. And what can you do for me? Sometimes it's just having those relationships is enough, and it will maybe someday help you, but maybe someday you can do something nice for somebody else too, and that's okay.
It's sort of like Christmas or Santa Claus. Actually, I think I get more thrills out of helping somebody else than I do out of them doing something for me. So
Yeah, that's very true. I wanted to pivot to mentors and champions and talk a little bit about how important is it to find mentors and champions in the business world, and how does one go about it? Um, if that's something that you've had mentors and champions, how do you go about finding them?
So I kind of view it the same way as a network. I think that if you go out and you're sort of like, it's about me and what can somebody do that, or somebody, like, companies will set up formal mentors. And I don't totally diss that, but I think when it's a forced situation, it often doesn't work nearly as well, right? And so in order for a mentor situation to work, the mentor has to actually want to spend time and help other people, not because they're told to do it, but because it's sort of in their nature. And if it's in their nature, they'll do well at it. And the mentor, I think, generally looks for people that want their input and are receptive to their input, and then they're willing to do it. So if it's just somebody that kind of walks in the door, they don't do that. But I think there's an excitement to helping somebody grow. And I'd say, even from my standpoint, I didn't look at it when I was younger, but as I get older, like, you want to give back. But you want to give back in ways that, or to people that you think will respect that. And so I have had a few mentors, and, the first one, probably the most important one to me, I think we worked together, but the mentor relationship really sort of took off after we quit working together, where they would still try to look out for me and make sure things were okay. And I could call them up and talk about things. Whereas when we were in the same company, we helped each other from a business standpoint, but it was much more about the here and now and what issues are we trying to take over. And afterwards, but that relationship came from that initial sort of working together, and then developed into more of a mentor relationship. And then, champions is interesting. A person that I worked with early in my career and then stayed in touch with later in my career, out of the blue, called me and said, "Hey, I've got this capital source that I know that I'm working with, and they're looking for somebody, and I think you'd fit the bill." And I had no idea who they were, hadn't really even heard of them. And they made the introduction, and then it worked out wonderfully. But they weren't a mentor, but they were a champion. Like, they thought enough of our relationship or what I did that they thought it would work, not just for me, but for the other person. And I think that's the key to a lot of this, is it should actually work for both parties. And the reason it sometimes breaks down is that people look at it as sort of like, what's in it for me? And most people don't react well if they're approached by somebody who's only in it for what's interested in them, and they don't take the time to understand what the other person really wants to accomplish.
Yeah.
But both of them are very important aspects in a career that if you can find people that you're comfortable with, it really can help you, because they make you look at things in ways that perhaps you didn't always look at it, and cause you to be a little more introspective.
Yeah, I love that, to be able to give you a different perspective. And I've found that too. I've learned so much from asking for help, which took me a long time to get to a point to ask for help. But it's wonderful to get different perspectives and different ways of looking at things. You know, sometimes you're thinking about A or B, and your mentor would be like, "You're on the wrong alphabet. We need to be looking over here instead."
No,
And so great to be able to shine a light on some of your blind spots. And then also the champions. I read somewhere recently that your brand is 60% what people say about you when you're not in the room. And I
yeah, I
thought
hadn't
that was
heard
a
that,
really,
but I love
really
that story,
important
because
thing.
I think there's a certain truism to it. You know, that is true, is that it's not what people are paid to say or what they pay, you know, what they politically say within the right things. It's what do they say when they're just being honest. And that is kind of who you are. I think one of the things you said I would also pick up on is that for anybody watching, it's not a sign of weakness to ask for help. It's a sign of curiosity and you wanting to expand yourself and learn.
Thank you. Yes, I think that is an important lesson to learn, especially when you're young and you're coming up and you're afraid to look like you don't have the answers. But I do think when you've done all the work and you've tried to figure it out on your own, I think it's also good to go and ask for help and say, you know, I've tried to figure this out, but I need a broader perspective, or I need more experience to help me understand what this really means. So thank you for amplifying that. To talk a little bit about advocating for ourselves, because it's such an important skill in career advancement. I would say a lot of times women and some underrepresented groups don't always do a great job at advocating for themselves for a number of different reasons. And I'm curious what you would tell our audience who are struggling to find their voice. What's the right way to ask for something that you want?
I think the right way to ask for something that you want is to think about ahead of time, who are you asking it of? And looking at it from their perspective. Sounds crass to say what's in it for them, but sort of like, how would they view it, right? So if you're looking at something from a corporate standpoint, they would have an obligation to make sure that what you're asking for is best for the corporation. If you're asking for let's call it a donation of time towards something, then figure out, does it affect something that they look at charitably or something of that nature that they're looking to do. Is that, think about when you approach them, don't make it just about, I want this, I want this. Think about how it's going to affect them personally or the organization personally, and how you want to phrase what it is. And most people, again, there's always exceptions, but most people, I think, want to help. And most of the time, if somebody doesn't ask or they're afraid to advocate for themselves, there's sort of a perception that it'll be difficult, or it's a perception that the person doesn't want to do it and they're going to have to talk them into it. That can happen, but it's rare. You know, most of the time, if you're not getting exactly what you want, it's because people are so busy, they don't have time to think about it, or they're not aware of what you're trying to get accomplished. Or they've got their own issues that they're dealing with at a corporate level. And so just the act of asking, most people will engage. About the worst thing that will generally happen is, I can't talk to you right this second, but can we make an appointment to talk? Is, you know, and then when you get them, when you're calm, just be direct to the point, talk about it, how it impacts can be change. Why, you know, and don't focus so much on, you. Focus on kind of the organization and kind of what's going to make it better for them. But you can just say, I would like to do this. I'd like this promotion. I'd like a chance to be exposed to these types of things. I'd like to spend more time on a charity thing. It doesn't even always have to be about work. And if you're uncomfortable doing it because you're not sure or you don't know the person, if you're uncomfortable doing it, start small and do a couple of test things with other people to sort of, like anything else, it's practice. And if you're approaching somebody that you don't know, you're not as likely to get a positive response as if you know them. So find somebody that knows them to introduce you, and don't make the ask on the first time that you meet that person. Get to know them a little bit first and what makes them tick, and then go through that. But I am somebody who's kind of eternally an optimist. I believe that most human beings are good. There are circumstances that make them do bad things or stupid things, but most people want to help if given the right circumstance and approached correctly.
Love that. Well, we are coming up on time, and I wanted to ask you two more quick questions, if I could.
Sure.
One of them is one of our favorite questions on our podcast, which is, what advice would you give to your younger self? So I am curious, what advice would you give to 22-year-old Dave McCaslin?
I think I'd give him the advice that I still haven't actually worked out yet, which is I spent so much time focused on performance and kind of what happened and kind of the people that were there and what was in front of me. I would say I could have done a much better job of managing upwards. And I'm a little better at it. I still don't think I'm that good at it, and I probably don't worry about it that much. But probably realistically, if I could have spent a little bit more time doing it, it probably would have made things easier. And, I think the corollary to that is you want to be competitive, you want to win, but you don't have to win everything. And so sometimes if you're right and you're convinced you're right, even if you're right, you may have won the battle but lost the war. You got to figure out, like, what am I really arguing over? And, so I'd say the other thing that I would look at is make sure that if you're sort of taking a stand, that it's really worth taking a stand over, and it's part of a longer term strategy and not just I'm in the moment and this is the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah, those are really good pieces of advice. And it has taken me many, many, many years to learn that it's more important to be effective than to be right. And I think
very well put.
Both of those go towards that thought. And sometimes it's very hard in the heat of the moment to remember that. And one of the themes you've mentioned again and again is to think about it more in the long game and the relationships over time. And is it more important to be right in this moment, or is it more important the end game and the relationships into the future? So thank you. And you've offered so much great advice in our conversation. I wonder if you might have one last piece of advice for our audience, keeping in mind that our mission is around empowering personal success. What would you offer as one last piece of advice to our audience?
So, over a career is a long period of time, and people talk about things like the arc of a career, and it implies that there's like this smooth curve that kind of goes on. And if you go out far enough, it probably looks like a smooth curve. But in reality, it's had all these little ups and downs and things that go along with it. And realistically, it isn't that smooth, because it isn't like, hey, I just got to keep running a marathon and put one foot in front of each other. There's an element of that. But I think for most people, there are a handful of times over 40 or 50 years where they are put in situations where they're going to make a decision that really can change their career for good or for bad, depending upon the decision that they make. So if you look at it for good, I think that you have to realize there are things that you cannot control. cannot really control the economy or kind of what the macro forces are. You can't control whether an opportunity exists or not. But you can control knowing what you value personally, what type of risks that you would want to take, what your long-term goals are, and be ready so that if an opportunity comes up. So if an opportunity does come up, and that's the time you start thinking about, should I do X or should I do Y? The mistake that most people make is that opportunity closes before they can figure out what they want to do. So if you can control, and you only get maybe 3 or 4 chances over 40 years, that something comes up and you already know what's important to you and what you want to do, when that opportunity comes up, you can act. And that's the thing that I would say, is that think about it less of a marathon and more of it's a series of races. And then you get to a point where there's a fork in the road. And as Yogi Berra would say, there's a fork in the road, take it.
Well said. Thank you so much, Dave, for sharing your wisdom, sharing all of these lessons that you've learned over the course of your career. And I really appreciate you making the time to be on and sharing it with our audience.
I said, happy to help. I hope somebody looks at this and learns something from it. I'd be very happy.
I know I already have learned a number of things from it, so thank you so much. And for our audience, if you've enjoyed this interview with Dave, I hope you'll go to our website. It's personalstories.com, where you can find other wonderful interviews with hospitality industry